Welcome again, everybody, to this meeting of the Victoria chapter of the Australian Academy of Liturgy. This is our last meeting for 2021, and it's interesting to find that we begin in the same part of the ecumenical world as we began our year in 2021. Those of you who have been following our program through the year will recall that back in March, we were joined by Dr. Jennifer O'Brien from the Liturgy Office in the Archdiocese of Adelaide, when she shared with us a presentation about Pope Francis's then quite recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti and its accompanying motu proprio, Spiritus Domini. Although on the surface the encyclical didn't appear to have any explicit liturgical content, Spiritus Domini certainly did, as it opened and formalised the roles of acolyte and lector to women. Now, of course, in a lot of Western places, these are roles that women have been fulfilling in worshipping Catholic churches for a very long time. But we should be mindful that there are parts of the world where this will be a positive permission to begin doing this. And so we come to November, and we're joined by Father Tony Doran. Father Tony will be well known to many Academy members who are joining us today, as he has been convener of this chapter, and he is a past president of the Australian Academy of Liturgy. He is presently parish priest of St Vincent de Paul in Strathmore in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. He is a member of Societas Liturgica, the International Society for Liturgical Study and Renewal, and he has written for the Australian Journal of Liturgy and Liturgy News, which is published out of Brisbane, and is a regular contributor to Pastoral Liturgy, which is published by University of Notre Dame, Australia. Father Tony's presentation today is titled, "But the Pope Said, Pope Francis, the Church in the Extraordinary Form." It's prompted by the publication of Traditiones Custodes, the motu proprio that Pope Francis published a couple of months ago, and its accompanying letter. These documents reaffirm the primacy of liturgical renewal prompted by the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, the very first document issued by the Second Vatican Council. These documents have also clarified the procedures to approve the use of the older forms of the Roman Missal, reinstating the position that was in place prior to 1987, when Pope John Paul II published regulations enabling it to be used. Now, I recognise that this might seem on the surface to be a very Rome-centric topic, yet it does have important ecumenical and interfaith implications. And Father Tony will certainly unfold some of these as his presentation proceeds. So please do join with me in welcoming Father Tony Doran as he speaks on But the Pope Said.
Thank you, Kieran. Hopefully I'll do all of that for you. It won't come as any great surprise or news to members of this Academy that one of the most significant changes affected by the Second Vatican Council in the Catholic Church was the renewal of the liturgy of the public worship of our Church. Drawing on more than half a century of scholarship, the bishops at Vatican II changed the look, the feel, the shape of worship in the Catholic Church with the promulgation of the first document, Sacrosanctum Concilium. The vote on Sacrosanctum Concilium came at the end of the second session of Vatican II in 1963, with 2,147 of the Council Fathers voting in favour to 4 voting against, and as I found in a footnote somewhere yesterday, there was 1 abstention. And it was formally promulgated by Paul VI on the 4th of December in 1963. So it would seem that with close to 100% of the Council Fathers in favour, 99.81% in fact, the Tridentine Mass was to be no more, right? Well, not quite. Debate on the Constitution on the liturgy had taken place during the first and second sessions of Vatican II, and Pope John XXIII had decided that the liturgy would be the first topic discussed by the Council Fathers because the preparatory document on the liturgy had found a great consensus among the bishops, many of whom had benefited from the liturgical movement in Europe. Now, Giuseppe Alberigo, in his really good short history of Vatican II, brief history, says, votes taken on both the entirety of the schema and on individual chapters always showed a great majority in favour, in spite of often tenacious minority, the often tenacious minority stubbornly opposed to any innovation. He goes on to make a very important point. This consensus found among many of the fathers who had hitherto been unknown to one another pointed to another reality, one that had not been planned or managed. The Council Fathers were becoming aware of their role and of the vast unforeseen horizons of the Council itself. Their favourable response did not concern the proposed text on liturgical reform alone. It also expressed a conviction that the time of fear, the era of the Church as a secure fortress, was over. I think that's something important to remember. Now, it would be another 6 years or so before the Commission charged with the task of producing the revised Mass would present its finished product. The so-called Missal of Paul VI was promulgated on the 3rd of April 1969, with the date for the celebration of the new Mass as the first Sunday of Advent that year, which was the 30th of November. Now, in fact, it was delayed by about a year because when Paul VI got some of the information, there were some bits that he didn't like and sent back to be redone. Notable changes from the Tridentine Mass included the reduction in unnecessarily repeated words and gestures. There was something like 25 signs of the cross over the bread and wine. They were reduced to 1. A greater selection of readings from sacred scripture, the use of the vernacular language in the celebration of the liturgy, communion under both species allowed, and the orientation of the priest changed from ad orientem, or facing liturgical east, to facing the people. Now, despite the near unanimous vote and promulgation of the Constitution on the liturgy, it's fair to say that the Mass of Paul VI was not greeted with universal acclaim. There was criticism of it for being too Protestant and not consistent with the Mass of Pius V, the Tridentine Mass. The most famous critique was possibly that of, it was called the Ottaviani intervention. It was written by 12 theologians who worked under the direction of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. Cardinals Alfredo Ottaviani and Antonio Bacci sent it to Pope Paul VI with a cover letter. Yeah, they were certainly not in favour of this new-fangled Mass. As early as 1971, though, permissions were sought from the Holy See, and they were granted, to continue to celebrate the Tridentine Mass. Now, these requests came from groups attached to the Latin liturgical heritage of the Church. There were also permissions granted to some elderly priests to continue celebrating the Tridentine Mass, the change being thought to be too great for elderly clergy to manage. In 1980, Pope John Paul II, reasonably newly elected at that stage, inquired of the bishops of the world about the state of the liturgical reform, especially concerning the way in which the priests and faithful of their diocese had received the missal promulgated in 1970. whether there were difficulties arising in the implementation of the liturgical reform, and about any possible resistance that may have arisen. The results of the consultation were sent to all bishops in December 1981, and on the basis of their replies, it appeared that the problem of priests and faithful holding on to the Tridentine rite was almost completely solved. However, since there were still some groups who were attached to the old Mass, John Paul II granted to diocesan bishops an indult or permission to allow priests and groups of the faithful to celebrate that Mass. And there were some conditions to that, though. Those to whom permission is was granted must accept the validity of the Council's liturgical reform, and the celebrations were limited to those groups who requested it. It could not be celebrated in parish churches. The celebrations must use the 1962 Missal, which was the last version of the Missal before Vatican II, and the celebrations must be in Latin. And there was to be no interchanging of rites or texts between the two missals. As a result, in 1984, the Congregation for Divine Worship published Quatuor ab hinc annos, granting the indult to bishops and outlining the conditions. Some further norms were published in 1986, clarifying the 84 norms. However, in 1988, there was a new development. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who had never been in favour of the liturgical reform or many of the other reforms of Vatican II, set up his Society of St. Pius X. It set that up in 1970 as an association of priests dedicated to preserving the pre-conciliar church. In 1988, he ordained 4 bishops without the permission of the Holy See, and so he created a schism. Now, to address this schism, John Paul II issued a new document called Ecclesia Dei, which not only excommunicated Lefebvre and the 4 bishops, but also stated that respect must everywhere be shown for the feelings of all those who are attached to the Latin liturgical tradition by a wide and generous application of the directives already issued some time ago by the Apostolic See for the use of the Roman Missal according to the typical edition of 1962. So, an act of disobedience to the Holy See by one small group of Catholics results in permission being granted for a much wider use of the pre-Vatican II Tridentine Mass. It was seen by some as a reward for poor behaviour. In the meantime, there were whole religious congregations founded which exclusively used the 1962 Missal. And the wider use of the 62 Missal also introduced a whole new generation of people to the Tridentine liturgy, and I think fostered an attachment to this liturgical phenomenon, thereby opening a gap between simply making a pastoral provision for those who had lived with the Tridentine liturgy when it was in normal use and bringing new adherents to it. This situation continued up until 2007 when another pope, this time Pope Benedict XVI, issued Summorum Pontificum. Summorum Pontificum widened the permission to use the 1962 Missal even further. And it did a very important, significant made a change in that the authority was no longer the local diocesan bishop, but rather the individual priest could decide which missal he was to use. Benedict in this document also created 2 forms of the Roman Rite, the ordinary form using the 1970 Missal and the extraordinary form using the 1962 Missal. Benedict argues that the so-called extraordinary form had never been formally abrogated. Most church documents, when they're changing something, will have the words at the end, anything to the contrary notwithstanding. Paul VI document formulating the Mass of Paul VI doesn't contain those words. Whether that was on purpose or a mistake, it's hard to know. Whenever anyone interested in liturgy and involved in liturgy raised this, the problems of this sort of document with people attached to the Latin liturgical heritage of the Church, the response that most of us got was, "But the Pope said." So if you had a Pope who said it was okay, they were very much in favour. One of the other developments of Benedict in this document was that he allowed the other sacraments to be celebrated in the preconciliar form. Baptism, marriage, penance, anointing of the sick, or probably I should have written extreme unction there, and confirmation. And priests were allowed to use the old breviary as well. And the books to be used were the last editions of any of these rites before Vatican II. Summorum Pontificium also gave permission to erect personal parishes for the celebration of what are called the ancient form of the Roman Rite. A personal parish is not a parish based on geography, but by reason of the rite, language, or nationality of the faithful. So in Melbourne, we have one of these parishes in Caulfield with St John Henry Newman as its patron. The wider use of the so-called extraordinary form saw these masses now being celebrated in many more places. Often when a new priest was appointed to a parish, people often found that the Saturday morning Mass would be celebrated in the extraordinary form. Anecdotal evidence suggests that there was very rarely ever consultation with the Mass-going faithful. They turned up to Saturday morning Mass, and not only was the priest speaking very quietly in a language that they didn't understand, but he was facing away from them. In Melbourne, we also saw the phenomenon of many newly ordained priests, the day after their Mass of Thanksgiving in the ordinary form, celebrating an extraordinary form Mass of Thanksgiving. Now, how a priest ordained in 2014, who would have to be at least 24 years old, can have an attachment to the Latin liturgical heritage of the Church mystifies me. Earlier this year, as Kieran mentioned, Francis issued Traditionis Custodes regarding the use of the liturgy, the ancient Roman liturgy prior to 1970. Also issued with this was a letter to bishops from Pope Francis explaining the context. In TC, Pope Francis recalibrates, if you like, the liturgical life of the Church, stating that the reformed liturgical books of Vatican II are the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite. So no longer, it seems, is there to be an ordinary form and an extraordinary form. The diocesan bishop is given back his authority over liturgical celebrations. He is to determine how they might be celebrated, even if they're to be celebrated, where and when this may happen, who may celebrate them, whether the personal parishes that have been created should continue. And it states that no more new groups of people celebrating the extraordinary form are to be established. The readings are to be proclaimed in the vernacular language in the form and translation approved by the Bishops' Conference. Traditionis Custodes does abrogate Summorum Pontificium. Prior to the publication of Traditionis Custodes, there'd been consultation of the bishops in 2020 about the use of the 1962 Missal. Now, I haven't seen the results of that consultation, but I think if you read the letter that accompanies Traditionis Custodes, you get some sense of where Pope Francis is coming from. The pastoral application and the extension of various permissions to celebrate the preconciliar liturgy over the years had been aimed at healing the division caused by the actions of Lefebvre Lefebvre. But these permissions had also taken as their starting point the validity of the liturgical reform of Vatican II. As Francis states, regrettably, the pastoral objective of my predecessors, who had intended to do everything possible to ensure that all those who truly possessed the desire for unity would find it possible to remain in this unity or to discover it anew, has often been seriously disregarded. An opportunity offered by St. John Paul II, and with even greater magnanimity by Benedict XVI, intended to recover the unity of an ecclesial body with diverse sensibilities, was exploited to widen the gaps, reinforce the divergences, and encourage disagreements that injure the Church, block her path, and expose her to the peril of division. Again, this evidence is anecdotal, but in places where the extraordinary form was celebrated, you could be hard pressed to find a picture of the current Pope, which is, I mean, pictures of the Pope are fairly common in most Catholic churches, but you often didn't find them where this was being celebrated. Francis was also saddened that the use of the 1962 Missal is often characterised by a rejection not only of the liturgical reform of Vatican II, claiming with unfounded and unsustainable assertions that Vatican II betrayed the tradition and the true Church. Francis goes on to say, a final reason for my decision is this: ever more plain in the words and attitudes of many is the close connection between the choice of celebrations according to the liturgical books prior to Vatican Council II and the rejection of the Church and her institutions in the name of what is called the true Church. In defence of the unity of the body of Christ, I am constrained to revoke the faculty granted by my predecessors. The distorted use that has been made of this faculty is contrary to the intentions that led to the granting the freedom to celebrate the Mass with the Missale Romanum of 1962. Because liturgical celebrations are not private actions, but celebrations of the Church, which is the sacrament of unity. They must be carried out in communion with the Church. So Francis can see a very real ecclesiological problem with the celebration of two forms of the liturgy in the Church. Another point that Francis makes in Traditionis Custodes, or it might be in the letter actually, his desire to return to a unitary form of celebration. Now, I'm not sure whether that means that at some time in the future, the use of the 1962 Missal will be ceased permanently, but the groups who are fearful of that, and not that I've had discussions with many of them, when they say that the Pope cannot dare do this, I sometimes look at them and say, but the Pope said, to remind them, you cannot take what one Pope says and disregard what another Pope says. There are problems with the way that the 1962 Missal does what it does and how it does it. The different ecclesiology that underpins it, I think Francis addresses. There's a very different worldview underpinning the 1962 Missal. You know, the preconciliar liturgy was I've got a quote here somewhere about that. Oh yeah, was for the most part developed at a time when the world was an agricultural society in Europe dominated by monastic spirituality. That's not the reality of many parts of the Church today. The different worldview also, you know, as Jenny O'Brien made in her presentation earlier this year, we in the Church of today, you know, it's unheard of to not have women involved. Now, I know that in my part of the Christian family, the involvement of women is not at the level that some would have it, but to not have women as readers, as ministers of communion would be unheard of. Of course, that never happened in the 1962 Mass. We began our time of prayer this evening with an acknowledgement of country. That could never happen in the 1962 Missal. The proponents of the 1962 Missal and its liturgy do have some point, though, when they say that the liturgies of today are not good enough. As a child who grew up in the 70s in the first flush of liturgical reform, or the era of what could be called liturgical creativity, with bright young priests making up their own Eucharistic prayers, their own creeds, the implementation of the revised liturgy was done very poorly in many places. There was a loss of an aesthetic sense. Not much about some of the early liturgical reformed liturgies was very beautiful. As someone said to me earlier today, oh yes, the era of felt banners. Well, that was just one example of, a loss of a sense of beauty. I think there are some important ecumenical and interfaith challenges. The old rite of baptizing adults, the adult who was baptized, if they had been considered in any way a pagan, they had to abhor idols and reject their images. If they were being baptized from Judaism, they had to abhor Jewish perfidy and renounce Hebrew superstition. If they had been a Muslim, they had to abhor Mohammedan perfidy, renounce this evil and faithless sect. And if, God forbid, they'd been a Bible-only Protestant, they had to abhor the evil of heresy and renounce the infamous sect of, insert name of, the particular group there. It's if 70, 80, 100 years ago, if a Catholic was, praying these words, maybe there was some context to it. To celebrate rites that use this sort of language today, I don't see how you can be accepting the reforms of Vatican II in how the church is meant to be in relation to our brothers and sisters from other parts of the Christian family and people of other faiths. The language is abhorrent. It's interesting to note, one of the points that's often brought up is the prayer on Good Friday for the Jewish people. By the time of the 1962 Missal, Pope John XXIII had already changed that and taken the phrase, the perfidious Jews, out of the Good Friday liturgy. So these ecumenical and interfaith challenges, I've not ever seen anybody ever refer to them as one of the problems of the extraordinary form, but I think the words are there. That's how we were meant to pray, and that's how people were praying, using these old forms. I think also there's some challenge presented, some further challenges presented by the 1962 Missal about the, the poor implementation of the liturgy. I've argued, and I'm no proponent of the old liturgy, but I've had arguments with choirs about using hymns in Latin because I'm told, oh, Father, we can't use any of that old stuff. Well, I think we actually have to be mindful of the liturgical heritage of the church and use that sort of stuff. Just because it's in Latin doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And I think one of the other things that perhaps the liturgical reform of Vatican II failed to take account of was the role of personal piety and devotion. I'm not sure that we've ever quite grappled with that. And I think that's perhaps one of the things that's behind some of the critique of the modern liturgy by those attached to the liturgical Latin heritage of the church, whatever phrase that's used in the documents. And Kieran, I think that's my my allotted time to speak up, and now we can discuss.
Thank you, Tony. There's a lot to grapple with there, and I'm just...
Yes, that's better. I don't want those words left up on the screen. They're not nice.
Yeah, great. We've got a bit over 20 minutes for some discussion time. If you have a question or a comment or a reflection you'd like to share, I would like to encourage you to share those. In order to be called to speak, please either put it in the chat or use the raise hand in the reactions function on your Zoom screen. And while you're thinking, let me thank you, Tony, for a very fascinating presentation that lays out the chronology and the changing focus of why the older rights were brought to use and the ways in which they were regulated. I think Fred Shade might have something he wants to say.
Thank you. Could you help me here? I'm a priest in the Liberal Catholic Church, which is very much a product of the early 20th century in England, and kept the language of the sacred language of the time, the thee and thou. I have supported this for a long time. I'm now having second thoughts, which is as a result of the cultural environment, I suppose you would say. And so I now have a mixture of these with the various daily prayers I have that I use in my own oratory. Could you comment on this in regard to the liturgical changes with the Roman Church and this aspect of language, thee and thou, which I see is still appropriate for liturgical settings, and you and your in addressing deity in private prayer. Could you sort of enlarge on that for me?
Sort of running parallel with a lot of this stuff about the extraordinary form was what I call the language wars in the Catholic Church, where our translations were revised to make the language more sacral. I'm not sure that it's actually worked. And I would, look, I'm not an expert in language to that level, Fred, but the new translation that we've got in English of the Roman Missal really doesn't work that well with its, trying to increase the register or heighten the register of the language because it's not the way people talk. It's not the way people in suburban Melbourne parishes, which is my experience. It's not the way they talk. Not that we need to talk like people at the cafes in Woodland Street or Napier Street in Strathmore necessarily, but I think we're not there anymore.
Okay.
Thank you. I have two questions, one from Paul Taylor and one from Colleen. Because Paul is following on the language question, we might put him first, and then after Paul has shared his question, perhaps Colleen might like to speak to hers.
Paul's question, I presume everyone can see it. What place might the celebration of the Mass of Paul VI in Latin have today? Perhaps at international gatherings, it might have some value, although most of the times when I have watched any masses from St. Peter's Basilica that the Pope's celebrating, he seems to celebrate in Italian. And the custom for a long time in papal liturgies was that whatever the main language would be, the readings would be in various languages. But I suspect the reason the Pope celebrates in Italian is because that's the language he's most familiar with and comfortable speaking. To my knowledge, I haven't heard Pope Francis preside in Latin, but I don't spend every waking moment either watching masses from the Vatican. I've got a bit too much to do. So.
Great. Colleen, you make reference to the new Anglican rites. So I wonder if you might actually speak to your question, just so we have the context that's in your mind.
Yes, thank you, Kieran, and thank you, Tony. That's been absolutely fascinating. I recently discovered that at the University Church in Oxford, St Mary the Virgin, they celebrate BCP, this 1662 rite, in Latin once every term. And I was hoping this would be live streamed and I would have been able to watch, to participate in some way, but it wasn't so. But I was interested to discover that, because in Tudor times, of course, the prayer book would have continued to be used in Latin by those who understood it. I was interested in one. I was wondering whether the groups that are reluctant, shall we say, to accept papal authority, have they knuckled under? And the more important question was, are you familiar at all with this new, Anglican patrimony rite? And
the Anglican Ordinariate.
Yes, and can you make any comment about what rites they're using?
Okay, with these groups, before the Pope's letter came out early this year, the Twitterverse was almost in fever pitch about this. There's almost been nothing from them since the Pope's document has actually come out. Now, again, I don't follow much of this stuff closely, but really I haven't seen much at all. Whether that means they've accepted it or not, I don't know. And again, it was then up to the bishop of every diocese to make decisions about how these celebrations were to continue, if they were to continue. The Archbishop of Melbourne had a meeting with all the priests, not just priests who celebrate this, to hear our views on it. And he's set up certain places where this can be celebrated. It greatly reduced from what it was. There are about 11 different communities celebrating in different ways and different forms. That's now down to about 5. So that's on that score. The rights of the Anglican Ordinariate are perhaps close to what Fred was hinting at. Lots of these and thous. I've got copies of all the liturgical books. I would find it really difficult to pray those prayers because it's not a register of language that I'm familiar with. It would be interesting, and I don't know enough about this. It was interesting when they were putting those books together, what suddenly became Anglican patrimony that could be included in those books. I suspect it would come as a surprise to many modern day Anglicans that some of that stuff was Anglican patrimony.
That'd be interesting to see, yeah. It's not online, is it? Do you happen to know if it's online?
I don't know whether it's online, but we'll have coffee one day and I'll bring my bag of books with me.
Sounds like a good idea, thank you.
Yeah. On the rights of the Anglican Ordinariate, their daily office book was published recently. And it's interesting to note just how bare bones it is. It follows the 30-day Psalter, which is a survival of the 1662. It has absolutely no antiphons for anything. very minimal seasonal provision, a massive appendix of votive offices, some of which are quite eyebrow-raising. Altogether, it's a document that reminds us of just why it was that Anglican Catholics back in the 1970s were very quick to adopt the Divine Office when it was issued after the liturgical renewal. I think we have Robert Gribben hovering ready.
Yes, I'm hovering here. Yes, I don't think it's healthy for me to think much more about Anglican ordinariates and all that, but I do remember debates in Orthodox liturgical circles back 20 years ago about an Orthodox Eucharistic prayer which would be acceptable to the Orthodox for converts from Anglicanism, and it was basically a form of 1662 with the 1549 invocation of the Spirit written back into it. And, you know, it really was a very plodding piece of compromise, and only Orthodox who really didn't know what they were doing could possibly have approved of it. That may have improved since. But I also add in, I have a friend who I wish I wasn't a friend, because she is an ardent Pius X member, and always tells me about the glories of the Latin Mass as she sees it. And she's a convert from Presbyterianism, and when she converted, the Latin Mass was it. So it's very important to her integrity as a Catholic that she's connected with this. So I have sympathy for her, but at the end of every conversation, I have a feeling that this group and that Mass is simply a gathering point of people who want to express their spleen and their hatred of the Roman authority. And I find it unacceptable. And I have now told her that on a number of occasions, but she can't hear it. And equally, I think she has a view of what the Uniting Church does, which is completely false. And that doesn't surprise me. And the mentioning of the Uniting Church brings me to another point, and that is, you know, I mean, those of us, and there are several of us here from the Uniting Church who've gone through the liturgical revolution since we were united in 1977, and the writing of 2 substantial liturgical books, are now confronted with the fact that neither book is either used, well, in most cases, either not used, but in more serious ways, forgotten. That is, the Church is proceeding in its liturgical life with reference to material they gain largely from the internet, without theological critique, and certainly not without any attempt to run it by a liturgical commission, which in any case is hors de combat. It does not exist. We don't have an authoritative liturgical body anymore in the Uniting Church. So, you know, it's much worse, brothers and sisters. Thank God that Rome keeps its hand on the tiller, and that the Anglican Church has a decent liturgical commission, because there are some of us who are floundering without either authority or a good learned commission. That's a bouquet to Colleen, by the way. Don't quote me.
It's been received gratefully. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, and I mean, the serious side of that is, and I'm speaking as a grandfather of 3 kids, well, 2, the significant ones being 14 and 12, who have rarely been in church since they were being able to be forced to go with their grandfather and grandmother. This generation of kids has nowhere to hook on to the faith. So if the liturgy is to have its evangelical purpose, which I believe it has, it's not its primary purpose, but it's one of its purposes. What that requires of the liturgy to a completely blind and liturgically blind and deaf culture, I don't know. This seems to me to be one of the biggest possible questions before us all in terms of language, symbol, gesture, action, context. Perhaps not for this particular meeting.
Robert, I was about to say it's not as if you offer us trivialities here. No trifles at all.
No.
However, I will talk to you about the possibility that maybe you might want to deliver another paper next year.
Yeah,
Yes, I was going to say, Robert, be careful.
I
There's a paper coming
I think
out.
I've stirred enough. I'm still getting shot over my very gentle objections to virtual Eucharists.
To bring us back to the topic at hand, and thank you, Robert, that's a fascinating reflection and important for us all.
Aaron Darcy's been waving his hand for a while too.
Oh, well, yes, thank you, brother.
Okay. So I've got two people in a row now. Paul Taylor has put something in the chat, but since Darcy is waving his hand, perhaps we might let him speak first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tony, very much for that clear history of this past couple of generations. My mind went back to Vatican I, and
As it often does, I'm sure, Darcy.
yeah,
Yes.
I had the good fortune to have the time to study Vatican I in relation to Vatican II many years ago. And the conclusion I came to was that Vatican I, faced with the growth of secularism and many threats, as the fathers of Vatican I saw it, to the tradition that they held, their response was to set up a kind of bulwark against the modern world. And that's why you get the doctrine of infallibility, for example. But there are other things in Vatican I along that line. Now, when Pope John the 23rd became Pope, he very deliberately said, no, the response to the modern world with all its issues should not be to simply set up opposition to it, but rather to, as he expressed it, open the windows, the famous phrase that he used, so that fresh winds could blow. And so he instituted a program which, of course, resulted eventually in all the documents of Vatican II. It's a different methodology, as Tony was telling us, a methodology of dialogue with the modern world. Not that you accept all modern concepts or you accept any idea that happens to come across to you, but rather that you enter into a dialogical relationship with the world. And that was, to my mind, the crucial difference in the attitude of Catholic reform from that time onwards. Now, as Tony was saying, for some people, that's not a good way to go. They want to preserve the church as it always was, or as they see it, that it was, but not to entertain this concept of dialogue, but rather simply to hold to a solid, unchanging tradition. Now, Vatican II takes a very different line, and so do most other churches around the world. So I warm to what you were saying, Tony, about worldviews. The Vatican I and Vatican II represent not just different theology and a different approach to liturgy, but different approaches to the modern world.
Yeah, and that's why that quote from Alberigo's Brief History of Vatican II, that the secure fortress mentality was crumbling. It was over.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
In the comments, Paul Taylor has written, Pope Francis has expressed some concern about the quality of the Ars Celebrandi of the 1970 liturgy in some places. How might communities capture a balance between say the black, do the red in relation to ritual rubrics approaches and celebrations that are adapted to the pastoral context? And I think we might call this the last modest question of our discussion as time is drawing on.
Yeah, Pope Francis does question the quality of the celebration of the 1970 liturgy in some places. I think, well, the way that I've always tried to do it is to actually know what the documents say in the first place, because you can't hope to apply it pastorally unless you've read the documents, especially the Pranotanda at the beginning of each ritual book, which are often really excellent summaries of the theology of what the church is doing at that point and how to do it and what adaptations can be made. If you don't know what the church is intending you to do, you can't hope to apply it pastorally. In a parish to which I was once appointed, I had a very good group of altar servers and a great parish MC. And when I got there, the first couple of times I said Mass, they were doing some very strange things. And genuflecting in all sorts of places, bowing at times I'd never seen a bow, indicated in the rubrics. So I would always with them, and the senior altar server and the prefect or the master of ceremonies were, I was going to say grown-ups. That's probably the wrong word. They were adults. They knew what they were doing. So I just took them back to the general instruction of the Roman Missal. Okay, why are you genuflecting at that part of the Mass? Let's see what the general instruction asks us to do. So I think you've got to go back to those foundational documents and see what they ask us to do, and then you can adapt it for the space in which you are. Moving to a new church recently, I've had to learn how to say Mass again because I'm in a different space and the way I move around that space is different. You can't it doesn't just happen. You've actually got to work at it. Just like you put effort into preparing a homily, you've got to work at the way you celebrate the liturgy. It doesn't just happen. And I think now the other benefit that the church has got, well, certainly, my part of the church, Paul, is that we've got educated lay people who know as much, if not more, than the priest does. So, and they know how things are done in their space. So that's good too. But it doesn't just happen. As good as the rites are, if you've never read the Pranotanda, you're never going to be able to adapt it to your local context.
Thanks, Tony. Very helpful.
Thank you to Tony and everybody who's contributed to our discussion tonight, one of whom can expect to be invited to speak next year. Before we wind up for the evening, there's a couple of things to share. This is our last meeting for 2021, of course, and our next meeting will be the Academy's National Online Conference, which will be held from the 18th to the 20th of January 2022. If you haven't already signed up, early bird tickets are still available for 20 days more. And I'm putting the registration link in the chat so that if you haven't already signed up for the National Conference, you may do so straight away.